What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so this is a video request from Daryl. He wanted me to do a video just hypothesizing how would HAKEEM Olajuwon fare on those dynasty Boston Celtics teams in the 1950s and 60s, as opposed to how would Bill Russell fare on those teams with the Houston Rockets in the 1990s. Okay, so I don't think it's just as easy as people, like it's just not as easy as people may think it is. So I'm still trying to digest this one, but I'm going to try to answer it as best I can. I'm going to start with, and like I said, these are just opinions, you know what I'm saying? Doesn't mean I'm right. It's just people seem fascinated with my opinions on when it comes to basketball. I don't know. I mean, first of all, HAKEEM Olajuwon, instead of being born in the 1960s, the early to mid 1960s, he'd been born in, I guess, the early to mid 1930s. Okay, which is around the time Bill Russell was born. So this happened being born 30 years prior. Okay, so with that, how would he be different? Well, I don't think he would have been a Muslim. That became more popularized in the 1960s. Maybe later in his career, maybe. But I do think, judging on his personality earlier on and having to deal with what you had to deal with back in those days, I think HAKEEM Olajuwon would have been a much more angrier person, and justly and rightfully so. I think he would have been more standoffish than he was. I'm just going with a personality thing now, you know what I'm saying, and differences. First of all, he was also born outside the country. So he would have had to deal with a lot of things that, don't get me wrong, he still had to deal with these things in his life, even being born in the 1960s, but it would have been worse being born in that time period. He would have, let's assume he went to the same college, University of Houston. I believe they were still around in the 1940s and 50s, University of Houston. Yeah, I think so. So let's say he went to the same college, but he had to deal with a lot of racism. Because if we're talking about the 1950s, most colleges at that time still played predominantly white lineups. So he would have had to have dealt with a lot of racism. Because I think Bill Russell was really the first heavily touted black star, as far as the draft. And he was known as a high jumper and all that, you know what I'm saying? HAKEEM Olajuwon in real life came to basketball late. I think he started playing basketball when he was like 16 years old. So he came to basketball very late. And let's just say he was drafted in, let's just say the same time period. Let's say he was drafted in 1956. Let's say he was born in 1935. All right. So he was drafted in 1956 for the Boston Celtics. And HAKEEM Olajuwon is going to have a terrible time dealing with what Bill Russell had to deal with in Boston. Bill Russell was a lot more militant in his personality, and I don't know if HAKEEM Olajuwon would have had the same type of vocalness when it comes to certain things. I think he would have internalized these things more. I don't know if he would have been as political. Maybe there would have been pressure on him to be as political as Bill Russell was back in those days. I don't know. but that's kind of like the personality I think he would have had. I think he would have been angry. I think he would have been bitter. I think he would have been difficult to deal with at times with his teammates, some of them, in particular his white teammates that might be perceived as him being racist. I just think that's something he would have to deal with. On the basketball court, I think that's where he would let off a lot of that steam. And this is where the video gets a little bit, I guess controversial if you're a Bill Russell fan. I have all the regard in the world for Bill Russell, but if you're comparing players, HAKEEM Olajuwon is probably the most skilled center in NBA history. Okay? If he had those same skills, however, what would he have been able to do on the court in those days? You know what I'm saying? It was a different game. I don't think in that era, especially the first few years, 50s into the early 60s, he would have been able to do a lot of the dunking that he did. That was frowned upon a lot in those days. If it was like a fast break jam, okay, that's one thing. But to be dunking on people, and facials and all that, it was looked at differently back then. People took that personally. The game was different. It was even rougher than the 80s and 90s, okay? I could see HAKEEM Olajuwon getting into a lot of fights back in those days. He was I know he's listed 7 feet and 255, but he was really like 6'10 and a half. When he came to the league, maybe like 235, 240, something like that. I could see him getting into a lot of fights. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know if he would have, at first, he would have displayed his total skill set, because it would have been looked at as, I'm a showboat. Because back then, guys who were like that, especially if you were black, you know what I'm saying, they looked down on that type of shit. Even coaches. Coaches were prejudiced too. But Red Auerbach was like this though. And this is why I think Olajuwon, that would have been the best team for him. And Red Auerbach was this way with Bob Cousy. Bob Cousy was a flashy player himself. Okay? Nobody cared because he was white. Red Auerbach had this thing where he didn't mind all of that as long as it didn't get in the way of the game. So eventually, Olajuwon would have displayed these moves that people nowadays would say, oh, y'all just exaggerating. Where's all the footage? He might do it in a couple of games, you know what I'm saying? But all these stories of games that we saw with our own eyes. Remember that move he did to Wilt Chamberlain? The move he did to Dave Robinson? Oh, man, he didn't do that to Wilt. I can't see Wilt falling for that. You know what I'm saying? Like, I could see him flourishing with the Boston Celtics. His role would have been a little bit different. He still would have been a great scorer. But with a team like that, with Bob Cousy and, putting up easily giving you 17 and 7, 8 assists, and then Bill Sharman giving you 20 a game, Tom Heisen giving you 18, 19, Havlicek giving you 14 or 15, Frank Ramsey giving you some off the bench. It wouldn't have been as much of a demand, and then Sam Jones giving you 18 to 22 points. Scoring wouldn't have been as big a problem for those teams as it was for the Houston Rockets. It was a different era. It was a free-flowing game. Teams regularly scored 115, 120 plus points a game. So scoring would have been an issue. So I don't see Olajuwon having to shoot as many shots. And I could see him putting up 16 to 19 points a game, because he wouldn't have had to score as much. His field goal percentage would have been better. It would have been more along the range of, instead of Russell shooting 44%. That's what he shot for his career. I think he would have shot maybe like in that era 47, 48% maybe. Just because the way defenses were back then, and also the way that shot selections were. A lot of times you took the first available shot, which didn't necessarily mean it was the best shot. And that could also hurt your field goal percentage a little bit. So I wouldn't see him shooting at 50, 52, 53% range. It was more 47, 48%. And where he would be a monster at is on the defensive end. HAKEEM OLAJUWON is one of the few players, him, Prime David Robinson, Nate Thurman, they're the only centers that come to mind that are comparable with Bill Russell on the defensive end. Wilt Chamberlain, too. But they're the only ones. HAKEEM OLAJUWON, first of all, would have been a shot blocking machine. He would have been up there with Wilt Chamberlain when it comes to blocks in that era. He would have been blocking because the era, it was so fast paced and you had more opportunities, more possessions. There have been more block shots. Centers were able to stay in the paint back then. I wouldn't be shocked if he blocked something like on average 8 to 10 shots a game in some seasons. But of course, they weren't officially recorded by the NBA, so it'll all be a bunch of, talk like we do with Bill Russell and Wilt. Well, the numbers aren't recorded, but you got to look at the unofficial tallies, and you got to look at common sense. But that's one thing. The rebounder, which would have been recorded, is where I think his numbers. First of all, his rebounds would have been much more inflated for that era. His rebounds would have been off the charts. Like, I think HAKEEM OLAJUWON led the NBA in rebounding once. I think it was once he led the NBA in rebounding. I'm not sure of that. I think it's once. But he was always amongst the leaders in rebounds. In his best days, he averaged about 11 and a half to maybe 13 rebounds per game, I guess. I could see in that era OLAJUWON averaging 18 to, maybe having seasons where he's averaging 18, 19, maybe close to 20 rebounds a game. I could see him having those types of numbers. And I could see him having like career averages of something like 17 points, maybe 19 rebounds. Assists would not be a category that would be official, nor steals, although he'd be a monster with those as well. He would be phenomenal. It would be, and I hate to say this, man, but in some ways it would be an upgrade. Now, I think Russell is a slightly better defender because he was able to guard all 5 positions in his prime. And he was a little bit better rebounder. But everything else, I tend to lean toward OLAJUWON. Maybe Bill Russell was a better team leader, I guess, certain intangibles. But as a player, skill-wise, OLAJUWON was incredible. Plus, he had range. Like, OLAJUWON had range out to 20 feet. Sometimes he could hit the 3. There was no 3-point line back then, but that's a hard player to guard. I mean, he wouldn't be able to stop Wilt. Okay? He would. But he could outplay Wilt, just like he outplayed Shaq in the finals. Prime OLAJUWON would have been a matchup issue because of his range, his quickness, and his skill set. He would have given, I think, Wilt some problems. Now, on the other end, on the defensive end, I think Wilt would have wore him down. Because as Bill Russell said, you could not guard Wilt Chamberlain the same way, or he's going to obliterate you. Wilt's going to probably use his strength against him, and that's where Olajuwon would be in some issues. Olajuwon wouldn't be able to stop Wilt one-on-one. That'll take a team effort to an extent. But I could see that Boston Celtics dynasty doing the same thing. I made this argument with Nate Thurman in the past. I think if you interchange Nate Thurman with Bill Russell, I could see them still winning at least 9 or 10 titles. Okay? With Olajuwon, I could actually see them winning 12 because I could see them beating the 1958 St. Louis Hawks with Olajuwon over Bill Russell. And that 50-point game that Bob Pettit had in Game 6 of that series may not have been enough. And in Game 7, I could see Boston winning that series. You know what I'm saying? That's my opinion. I think HAKEEM Olajuwon with the Boston Celtics would be very successful. He'd be legendary. I could see them still winning 11, possibly even 12 championships. I don't think that the Celtics would have beaten the 67 76ers, though. That team was just one of the greatest teams of all times. Like, literally, one of the greatest teams of all times for a single year. But I do think they would have won 11 to 12 titles in his career. And HAKEEM Olajuwon would still have some of these same problems that people have today. They would discount him because of the era that he played in. Saying if he played in the 80s and 90s, he would have, wouldn't be able to beat anybody. He would have played against nobody. And the same arguments that you always hear when you talk about players from the 50s and 60s. But that's my take on if HAKEEM Olajuwon was on those Boston Celtics teams in the 1950s and 1960s. You know what I'm saying? That's just my take on that scenario. Okay? Just trying to think of anything I might have left out. I do see eventually HAKEEM Olajuwon joining the Nation of Islam sometime in the 1960s and possibly becoming a political leader just because of that era. Most of the conscious sports stars of that era became politically involved, whether you're talking about Jim Brown or Cassius Clay, a.k.a. Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, who else is up there? Later on, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So, yeah, I could see him going that route. And his whole life may have been different. He may have been, looked at totally different. Some people might have him as the GOAT, but that's a whole different video. Because, like I said, some people look at that era with a scornful eye, with a skeptical eye, thinking that they played against nobody. So maybe you have the same problems that Bill Russell still has today. And maybe we would look at Bill Russell in a different light. So I'll do that in the video coming up. Tell me what you guys think.